Welcome to Par Lettres, a long-form podcast hosted by Nishi Pandit and Andrew Flores, where we explore the work of Jacques Lacan through free associative conversation. Par Lettres exists as an invocation and enactment of analytic discourse, where we speak from the locus of our own desire and engagement with Lacan's oeuvre. We invite you to hear Lacan through the conversation of speaking beings, whether you are philosopher, student, clinician, or simply curious about what psychoanalysis has to offer to the cipher of our mortal destiny. We are inaugurating our podcast with a series of episodes on Lacan's formidable essay, The Function and Field of Speech and Language in Psychoanalysis. In this episode, Empty Speech and Full Speech, we discuss the preface, introduction, and first section of Lacan's essay. So here we are. We're going to look at Lacan's seminal essay, The Function and Field of Speech and Language in Psychoanalysis, published in the Écrit, also known as the Rome Discourse. And I think it's interesting, Andrew, that we chose this to inaugurate the Par Lettres podcast because in so many ways, like this paper, this discourse, this essay, it's all of those things, is like Lacan's inauguration of psychoanalysis, I think. And so I feel like this is a really good place to start. I guess you could say maybe this is early Lacan, middle Lacan. It's like he's just before the first formal seminar, right?
Yeah, and it's like only a couple months later that he then conducts seminar one, Freud's papers on technique and the metapsychological essays that coincide with it. But it's like everything that's talked about in the seminar teaching is sort of uh, already figured into this essay that we're about to talk about. And it's so funny that it's called the Rome's Discourse. And I think uh, when he was in Rome trying to deliver it, I think he went so far as to try to go to the Vatican and talk to the Pope about psychoanalysis. So you can see how ambitious he was about not only the return to Freud, but instituting psychoanalytic practice and teaching that was sort of you know, a, a return of a Promethean act, which he in this essay contributes to Freud. And, with Prometheus giving the fire comes the consequence of being, what is it? He's shackled down and then he has the birds pick out of his rib or flesh or whatever. And in a sense, it's the way in which both Freud, in his discovery, spreads his teaching and then it becomes bastardized and then his name gets slandered. And then you have Lacan doing the same thing of resuscitating it and even, creating his own spin off of Freudian practice only to get, excommunicated by the IPA.
Right.
But as you said, this is what's considered the early Lacan. And I'm always dubious of using this sort of chronology of the early Lacan, middle Lacan, late Lacan.
Mm-hmm.
Insofar as the main stream periodization is oh, you have early Lacan that's only focused on the imaginary. Then you get the middle Lacan that's focused on the symbolic, and then Lacan has the real later. It's they're already there. All these three registers exist from as early as the late 1940s to the early 1950s. But he does give a huge you could say emphasis on teaching about the topic of the imaginary, only so far as we could situate it in its context and show that the imaginary is the creation of narcissism, the function of the ego. But this is not what we're trying to situate ourselves in psychoanalysis. We have to see the subjectivity in all three registers, right? But that is a bit of a digression. The point is when we're talking about early Lacan, we should see that early Lacan, and what makes this essay so pivotal is one, what the title's called, the function and field of speech and language, but also that this is where Lacan starts to introduce the Saussurean paradigm. And what that means, for our learners that are listening, Ferdinand de Saussure was a linguist, and he conducted a series of lectures that his students compiled into an introductory course on language and linguistics. And in it, he has this sort of theory of language that could be sort of, structured into an elementary form known as the sign, right? And the
Uh-huh.
sign is comprised of the signified, also known as the referent or the thing or the concept or the meaning. And then below, you have what's called the signifier. In Saussure's terms, it's defined by being an audio image, right? And we can just see it as like a written word, right? Um, but this is what comprises the term a sign. And a sign is what refers to something for someone. And we could see this in practical terms, like you see a stop sign, right? A red, uh, what is it, a pentagon or hexagon
Mhm.
with the letter stop on it, which is a sign that refers to something for someone. You're driving, you see a stop sign, that is referring to the action of stopping, of ceasing to move, right?
Mhm.
So there's an indication to that. There's a index to meaning,
Mhm.
and that's all fine and dandy. And for Saussure, we live in a field of signs. We communicate through speech, uh, all these different signs, and they have a correspondence. Uh, but it's also a problem of the theory of language in general. Of like, do signs necessarily correspond to the objects they refer to, or to put it simply, like, does the word already uh, contain the object, or does the object already contain the word within it? Like,
Mhm.
is it a table because that's what, like, it's just that's what it is. And to like a layperson, they just be like, well, it's a table because it's that. It's red because it's red, right? All these sort of
Mhm.
tautological things, but in the sort of sophistication of a theory of language, it's more um complicated to that, right?
Mhm.
And so to cut a long story short, Saussure says that, oh, the correspondence between the word and the thing are just simply arbitrary.
Mhm.
Now, Lacan will flip that on its head and privilege the signifier over the signified. And the signifier does not relate something for someone. It does not relate a thing from a wholly instantiated individual to
Mhm.
another wholly instantiated individual, right? And
Mhm.
that's the key part, is that we're not dealing with like these sort of individuated whole personas that speak signs and refer meaning and communicate meaning and messages to another wholly instantiated ego or persona,
Mhm.
or whatever term you want to use, or individual. Rather, this inversion of the sign to the signifier allows us to place psychoanalysis on the same field as linguistics, because they are dealing with the same object of theoretical inquiry. And this leads us to understand what Freud's theory of the unconscious was, that became uh, sort of deviated from in later years of psychoanalysis. And I'll just kind of conclude right there, so you could like respond back to anything that I've said, or even riff off more. But like, you know, this essay is so important because what he's trying to do is not only return to Freud, but a specific aspect of Freud that is neglected. When we look at the interpretation of dreams, when we look
Mhm.
at psychopathology of everyday life, when we look at jokes in their relation to the unconscious, Freud
Mhm.
is looking at language. And
Right.
sure, he didn't have the theory of the sign, he didn't have structural linguistics, he didn't use the term the signifier, but the
Mhm.
form is still there in the way that he notices language function. I mean, in his forgetting of the name Signorelli, when he's trying to talk to his colleague, he then starts to make an association chain of all the internal phonemes and stuff like that, and how forgetting of the name is replaced by these other sorts of phonemes that create different chains of names, etc., etc. So
Mhm.
this is what Lacan sees is important for analytic theory and practice.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, I think this is where maybe we see Lacan's most elaborated form of his fundamental theorem that the unconscious is structured like a language. Again, this is something that he sees in Freud, right? For example, Freud says that a dream is a rebus, and that it's something that you can analyze at the level of a sentence, like Lacan again will emphasize that more. And that's maybe his power, is the way he brings out the implications of Freud, recasts them, re-emphasizes them, highlights them, maybe even radicalizes them a bit. I think that quote is actually in this essay, so we'll get there. But also, you brought up the three registers, and I think that's important because we are here with Lacan at the very inception of his articulation of those three registers, right? Because he gives this talk, the symbolic, the real, and the imaginary, just before delivering this paper, like some months before. And that talk is published in this small publication called On the Names of the Father, where it's paired with a discourse he gave 10 years later. But he says in this talk about the symbolic, the real, and the imaginary that it's something like his preface to the Rome discourse, right? Which he had not given yet. So I think that's interesting. Like, why did he set the stage with the registers? It's like he wants to go ahead and lay out the domain of the unconscious, right? It's structured like a language, but it's evident in these three registers. It has these domains of experience. It exists, and it can be understood with more rigor, for example, like when we come to the imaginary, the symbolic. Like Lacan is here to differentiate for us what the imaginary versus the symbolic versus the real actually is. And so, and also you brought up the Vatican. I think, upon rereading this earlier today, I was really struck by that thread. It's actually threaded into this essay, this theme of the Vatican. And I think that relates to something he's trying to do, which is to say that there's something about speech that is sacred. There's something about speech that is a gift. There's something about psychoanalysis and psychoanalytic experience that functions on the basis of speech that makes central to its ethic the invitation to speak. And in a way, this is not original. It's like Lacan is just pointing out what psychoanalysis even is. What makes it what it is that there's no modality per se, except the invitation to speak, right? And Anna O says this is the talking cure, right? This inauguration of psychoanalysis. She calls it that. And Lacan is just really giving us an articulation of the full import of that recognition, I think, in a way that nobody has before. And he's doing it in a fabulously poetic form, which, as I've remarked before, I think this is one of the great pieces of writing of the 20th century, this essay of Lacan's. It's not only foundational in the theory of psychoanalysis, it is a unique written document. It is a text, it is a communication, it is a style. It is so many things that it illustrates itself, and his ability to do that with language is very interesting to me. And so I think there's so much in this essay, and maybe a good place to start is to start diving in. We're just going to go through the preface, introduction, section 1. This is a large essay. It's like a small book, basically. So I don't know, was there anything in like the opening here that really struck you?
Yeah, even before diving into it, you mentioned like it's like it's small book. There's actually a publication of this essay on its own. It's translated into English by Anthony Wilden, and it even has commentary. But it's titled "Speech and Language in Psychoanalysis." It's got Freud's face on here, but this is actually just the function and field. And there's just like a huge commentary at the end with a bunch of like footnotes and stuff like that. So like, you could even get this copy on its own outside of just getting it with the a Cree. But I think like to before we even like describe like the positive aspects and the positive definition of speech and language for Lacan, it's like we have to juxtapose a psychoanalysis that uses speech and language in its return to Freud versus one that doesn't. And what does that look like? And this is his initial criticism in the introduction. He sees three problems in the way psychoanalysis is practiced uh, during his time, and we could even say it still exists because Lacanian psychoanalysis and the Freudian psychoanalysis that Lacan envisions
Mm-hmm.
is not hegemonic, right? We still have, at least like in America, um, where it's like slightly different in like Latin America and even certain parts of Europe. Apparently in France, they're like trying to ban psychoanalysis, right? Like apparently they're trying to make it illegal. This is crazy. But in America, like the dominant institutions in New York and in Chicago, they are like what are titled like modern analysis, which is just like um a blended form of ego psychology, uh, which is, focused more on the ego than language, strengthening the ego's defenses.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have like other forms of psychoanalysis that focus on attachment, that focus more on affect, relational, etc. And this is not what Lacan thinks Freud's project is about. And so like the three criticisms that he has, or the three problems, the first one is like the function of the imaginary. Now we already talked about the imaginary insofar as like the imaginary is like the structure of the ego. It's the myth of Narcissus. And we
Mm-hmm.
covered this in our previous conversation on my channel on the mirror stage. This is the structure of the imaginary, in which the subject recognizes itself as an image, right? Which is combined with the saying, that's me, this sort of mythic moment of the child receiving this false autonomy of the body of this assemblable image, right? Um, but this shouldn't be taken literally. Like, it's not about like an actual child looking in the mirror. This is a sort of analogy to show how, like, in language, there's an imaginary dimension in which the signifier reveals itself in an imaginarized form. What does that mean? It means that, the child is now able to uh identify and think with its ego, right? Uh I am that, you are this. So there's this sort of elementary differentiation, but it can only be established by the I, which is also sort of trying to index the body, the fragmented body, right? The problem with focusing on just the imaginary part for Lacan is that this is the only emphasis of uh these other schools' point of departure. Like thinking about fantasies that relate to some type of like infantile stage, right? And with that you forget the symbolic dimension that actually insists and allows the imaginary function to persist as well, right? So like you're only seeing things from a sort of limited perspective, and it's because you're only focusing on the ego. We could literally see the imaginary emphasis as like what dominates ego psychology, um, and in that you end up in this sort of false um you could say this like sort of false notion that the suffering patient is so focused on imaginary fantasies that they need to tap back into reality, right? And really, the only reality that they're trying to tap back into is what the analyst deems is reality by their standard and even by their ego. The
Mm-hmm.
ego that is healthy and has strong defenses that are integrated and molded are the analyst ego. The second problem is the concept of libidinal object relations. And I think this kind of goes hand in hand with like the ego psychology, but it's also different because we're talking about, I think, the Kleinian
Mm-hmm.
approach. And it's libidinal versus like the object relations of, I would say, like, like the other British school, like Winnicott and what is it? Guntrip and Fairbairn. Klein focuses at least on the Freudian libido, but this becomes like sort of stagist, where it's like you got the like it's very crude, like oral phase, anal phase, and it becomes so reductive that it's like you try to literally psychoanalyze children to find where is this object relation happening, which is so funny because, and he mentions this in this essay, that when Freud analyzed childhood sexuality, he was analyzing it by or theorizing childhood sexuality from the perspective of working and analyzing adults. talking about their sexuality retroactively, right? And we could talk about how that term retroactive comes into play with psychoanalysis later, but that's like also like the problem of again of these two modalities is that they forget speech and language, right? And the way that it structures the unconscious and how it's a tool used in psychoanalysis versus focusing on a purely imaginary ego that needs to be um you know rekindle back together. The libidinal object relations, which is like focused on like, this sort of crude libidinal dynamism. Uh, it also reminds me of just like your unconscious is these cauldron of instincts and fantasies. Of course, Klein's slightly different. I'm kind of giving her a
Mhm.
disservice in explaining it, but the point is that the object relation is also focused on an object versus like the fact that for Freud, an object relation is a lacking object. Um, and the last part is countertransference. Countertransference, I mean, we could even just say like for Lacan, like, and even Lacanians, there's no such thing as countertransference. What you're just talking about is literally the transference of the analyst onto the patient. And when you do that, then you are literally uh, stultifying, if not terminating the analytic session or the analytic treatment and direction without realizing it. Because the point is to guide the treatment through the direction of the patient's speech and language. But here you are focusing on countertransference. And this example could be like focusing on like how I was talking with my girlfriend Ellie about like, the way she would define countertransference or what that looks like in these other modalities. And it would be like, if a patient shows up 5 minutes late all the time and, the analyst would be like, I noticed that every time when we have a session, you're always 5 minutes late, is there something about me that you don't take seriously? Right. The sort of positing oneself into the analytic framework as if you like have some sort of like aura or mana that's affecting the patient's ability to do the treatment. It's kind of like grandiose, right? um like it's like that meme, is such and such in the room with us right now? Are the Epstein files in the room with us right now?
Mhm. Mhm.
But I mean, this is a problem. But like all three of these things are problems for analytic work, and this is not something that Freud himself advocated.
Mm. Right. And I think that it's important, these three things. Lacan is laying out his critique of the current state of psychoanalysis at the time that he's giving this discourse, right? So he's saying these are the issues, this is what's happening in the mainstream. This is what exists in the name of psychoanalysis, right? And I'm going to say something else, I'm presenting something that actually critiques, all of this, that takes psychoanalytic experience beyond the imaginary, beyond object relations, and beyond countertransference, right? And he has a very serious reply to each of these, schools of thought, you could say. And again, he takes Freud as the center of his critique. He's saying like, I can actually substantiate my critique with Freud, and people can argue about that up and down, whether or not Lacan constitutes like a literal return to Freud or not. I think that he's obviously taking Freud and then he's rebirthing psychoanalysis. And actually, on that point, I wanted to mention this passage because why does he formulate this critique? Is to make speech the center of psychoanalytic experience, practice, process, theory, everything. It's really about speech, the function of speech. Language is the field, speech is the function, right, for Lacan. And he's going to distinguish these more and more as he weaves through the essay. But in the preface, he mentions Aulus Gellius, who I'd never heard of. But he says, indeed, I recall that well before the glory of the world's loftiest throne had been established, Aulus Gellius and his Noctis Atticae attributed to the place called Mons Vaticanus the etymology vagire, which designates the first stammerings of speech. This is page 198, and on a first reading, I had no idea what he was referring to. But again, Lacan is extremely erudite. He knows exactly where he's speaking, and the significance of delivering this paper in Rome is not lost upon him. In fact, he makes it conscious at the outset. And when I looked this up, I found that Aulus Gellius was a Roman grammarian. Okay, so here we are at grammar. He lived from 125 to 180 AD. And so here already Lacan's referencing a grammarian. And of course, later he's going to talk about Abhinavagupta, an Indian grammarian. We'll get into that later, when that comes. But I thought this was notable also for the Vatican reference because Mons Vaticanus means Vatican Hill. And this has the connotations of divination and prophecy. That's what it means. And this root, he's saying that Aulus Gellius is saying that the root of the word Vatican is vagire, and vagire means to cry, to cry out, to wail, like the wailings of a baby, right? And so right after he says this, he says, "If then my talk was to be nothing more than a newborn's cry, at least it would seize the auspicious moment to revamp the foundations our discipline derives from language." And so I think that's very profound because he's playing off the Vatican linguistically. He's playing off of it in space, like in the sense that that's where he's delivering this, like in Rome. He's saying that there's something about the Vatican, like speech, the stammerings of speech, the cry of a baby being the origins of vocalization, and that there's something prophetic here as well, something sacred, and that his entire discourse that he's about to deliver is like a newborn's cry, like a rebirth of psychoanalysis in relation to language. That's like how I read that. I was like, wow, this is interesting.
No, that's really good. And the fact that he says this thing like later on in another essay of like, it's the child whose cry gets elevated from the thing to the to the sign, right? And he's really talking about the signifier because that's like where it's this cry, this indication of suffering. It's not based upon any sort of object in the world, but rather a lack and something that is constituted by uh the signifier, which can only be constituted from the function of speech in the field of language, right? And we're not talking about like the baby's cry from like looking at the signifier and speech from like a developmental point of view of like this sort of like um billiard ball causality of like A, B, C. Actually, like, no, we can only get from A when we already have the alphabet already constituted, right? So we're going backwards to go forwards. But also, I really like what you said about in terms of like the cry. I think you had mentioned like divination, right? Um, because one of the things that he will say in regards to not only the child's cry, but also like the unconscious that speaks, speaks the truth. And so what's interesting about Lacan is, of course, he coins this to Freud, but for Lacan, it's the psychoanalytic um, discovery of the unconscious that brings the categories of truth and knowledge back together, which you only really see them coincide as early as like antiquity um, and ancient philosophy, and then there's this split between knowledge and truth that happens with modern philosophy. Hegel kind of somewhat brings it to the forefront, but it's really um, Freud's achievement of discovering the unconscious in this Copernican revolution, where knowledge and truth come about from the standpoint of the unconscious that speaks the truth, not because it contains, something true, but it's the fact that it's true because it speaks, right? Now, what does that have to do with, revelation and divination? Well, it's because for Lacan, this means that rather than a discipline that uses the analogy of seeing and light as a comparison of truth or knowledge, it's rather the oracular tradition, right? Of the Oracle of Delphi that says, know thyself, right? And it's not because we have to look within to know ourselves. Rather, it's the form of the oracle that reveals this truth that is specific for you, right? That has an effect on you. And this is what happens in the speech act when the analyst positions themselves in a way where there is transference and also the analysand is allowed to enter into free association. This oracular knowledge is constituted, and that is constituted from the interruption by the signifier that is the oracular truth that must be heard, right? That could only be heard.
Hmm. Yeah, this is why, like, I've sometimes thought of analytic discourse as an oracular vernacular. You know, it's like it's a mode of speech that is at this intersection of time. You know, there's a temporal dialectic here that the analyst is maintaining through their desire, right? They prevent the stagnation of this dialectic through speech, in which a patient, the analysand rather, can historicize themselves, you know, in a new way, and like rewrite their own history, and foretell, you know, what is to come, which is the advent of their own desire, no longer subverted, you know, but brought into something that moves, you know, the motor of analysis itself, which is again the transference being key for that. So I do think there's something to that. I think there's, you know, as a slight side note, there's some interesting correlations there between the mirror stage and the fact that the structure of subjectivity is like divined in a mirror, and that this is well, as Lacan says, the birth of language, or our entrance into the symbolic order. It has this oracular quality even in that way. It's something seen in a mirror. It's like our conception of ourselves, as illusory and narcissistic as that is, also allows us to constitute language in a specific way, which is now inherently oracular. And the oracular function of that can only be realized, you know, through speech in an analytic context, really. You know, it's not so much trying to find the image of the archetype, you know, that is ours, so to speak, you know, that is this introspected thing. Again, that would be the first critique, you know, the issue of the imaginary, right? This is not where Lacan is placing psychoanalysis. So, I mean, just right out of the gate, I think Lacan, it has set the stage in a way that nobody has before.
Yeah, and just to supplement what you were saying regarding transference with what he kind of elaborates on in seminar one, because he's using this essay to navigate his first seminar teaching,
Hmm.
is that like he's focused on what he calls symbolic transference, right? And this means that, you know, if you're focused on that symbolic transference, then you have no need to use countertransference. And the symbolic transference is sort of like the effect of like the unconscious, like making itself known by speaking itself. And what that means is that like you get yourself out of this mindset that when you're under analysis or as an analyst, when you're conducting the analytic work, that it's not two bodies in one room. You have to account for the third, and the third is the function of language and all its complexities and rules, and how that operates within speech. Um, and I think I don't know if you have anything more to add in the intro, but I think that brings us to, you know, what is this speech? And he kind of distinguishes two poles of speech. You have empty speech and full speech. And I think in our sort of elaborated like dialogue so far, we kind of uh, indicated what this concept of full speech is. It's what reveals truth. It's the unconscious that speaks. But empty speech is nothing more than like idle chatter, right? It's, you know, anything from just like self-absorbed talking on and on and on and about your life, and it doesn't really amount to anything. It's like somehow you're not even really interested in talking to the analyst, or even like in an everyday context, it's like the sort of self-centered chatter that like doesn't even bother to incorporate other people around you. You're just talking about your own life, your own luxuries, what you like, your designer brands, et cetera, et cetera. But then it could also be like the incorporation of like the everyday speech of just like muddle of just like uh what celebrities dating who, what's going on in the world, all these different sort of like perspectives and key points of like current affairs, and there's no way to tell like what's true or not. Like it's just, I mean, he'll use. I don't like to use it because like there's a lot of people that I know that and like that will like kind of uh see Lacan and Heidegger as one and the same, but they're not. But he will kind of say in this, essay and even in this seminar that empty speech is sort of synonymous with Das Man in Heidegger. And what that
Yeah.
means is that like it's the they speak, it's the they, it's the idle chatter that keeps one concealed from, their everyday being in the world or Dasein. But for Lacan, he really means it like this is the speech that protects the analysand from encountering their unconscious, right? It is an always already censored speech or speech that derails from actually saying what's on their mind, right?
Right. And so Lacan is going to give us this distinction between empty speech and full speech. And he's going to say that what is it? What is analytic discourse? Like, what is the discourse of the unconscious through free association in the context of transference is full speech, and this is what we're interested in analysis, right? I think later there's a comment from him about, he's justifying his short session and saying that, if I wasn't practicing the short session, I would have just been listening to my analysis and like go on about Dostoevsky for like an hour, and like, this isn't really what's relevant to the situation that they're in. So there are these diversions, right, that people set up, which is their own resistance, which goes back to countertransference, because for Lacan, all resistance is on the side of the analyst. Interpretation provokes resistance as well. He's not really there to interpret, and there's really nothing to interpret. There is the phenomenon of full speech itself, which is an analytic, event. This is, the unconscious speaking. The fact that it begins to speak in this way, to function in speech, is what makes the analytic encounter significant, useful, valuable. And something I was thinking about also, where was it? I think it's back to the introduction for a second. Um, these epigraphs that Lacan has placed. You had mentioned in the beginning that he describes Freud's Promethean discovery, right? Stealing the fire, as something that's uniquely human in a way. And I think also psychoanalysis is uniquely human. A uniquely human situation, there's no modality in between these two people, right? It's just offering something relational, offering a transference, right? There's nothing really more human than this. And speech, right? Speech is very human. It's what makes us human. But this epigraph in the introduction, which he attributes to Lichtenberg, who I don't even know who Lichtenberg is, to be honest. But he says, "We shall determine this while we are still at the aphelion of our matter, for when we arrive at the perihelion, the heat is liable to make us forget it." And I wanted to seize that because he's using an astronomical language there, like maybe it's the aphelion is distance from the sun, you know. Perihelion is proximity to the sun, So this idea of an orbit, like the orbiting bodies, the planetary bodies. Then the next epigraph is a quote from Robert Browning, a poet. This might be Lacan's first reference to a poet in the essay. There's going to be more poets that are referenced. "Flesh composed of suns, how can such be?" exclaimed the simple ones. And this is from a poem of his. But again, back to the sun. It's like this idea of proximity to the sun. Like we're somehow getting close in our orbit, in our revolution to the real. You could say possibly like the sun is this idea of the real. Like if we're using astronomical symbolism here, it's like everything revolves around the sun, right? The sun is the center. It's the gravity of this entire process that's happening up there. But it struck me the very first sentence that Lacan writes in the introduction after those epigraphs. Such is the fright that seizes man when he discovers the true face of his power, that he turns away from it in the very act, which is his act of laying it bare. This is true in psychoanalysis. Freud's Promethean discovery was such an act, as his work attests, but that act is no less present in each psychoanalytic experience humbly conducted by any one of the workers trained in his school. So this leads to the three critiques that you've already mentioned. But I don't know, I thought something interesting that resonated with me was his use of the word seize, because I can't say whether this was intentional for Lacan or whether this is a phenomenon of the unconscious, but in Sanskrit, the word for planet is graha, and graha means that which seizes. Something which holds, which influences you, which grasps you, which has it, which holds you in some way to it, you know? You could say the unconscious has this seizing function, you know, to the degree that we don't speak its truths, those truths remain hidden, they remain censored in the text that we're living out anyway, you know? Like, why did he use these astronomical, you know, metaphors, it would seem? And maybe there's something in it that relates to the oracular. It would be just like Lacan to put something cryptic like this, you know, in the background. So I don't know. I just thought this is just my free association with it.
No, I think you're bringing up something interesting. I really like the play on seas and Sanskrit, because the way I'm interpreting, like, with these two quotes relate to, again, what I had mentioned of the Copernican revolution, right? So you have Nicholas Copernicus, who speculated that what if, like, it wasn't, the everything that revolved around the Earth, but rather what if, like, everything revolved around the sun, and it took Galileo's invention. Well, he didn't actually invent; he just refined the telescope with better optics to see things more accurately and clearly, to actually prove that uh, the Earth actually revolved around the sun, not the other way around, but then also that the sun moves too, right? And that was definitely a huge leap in science, because pretty much this is the inauguration of modern science. Modern science is founded off of this Galilean and Copernican revolution, to which then we have Descartes, who then creates the subject of science, which is rooted in a fundamental doubt, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then also a field of knowledge that guarantees not only certainty, but my position and possibility to doubt, right?
Mm-hmm.
What does this have to do? Well, because we have series of Copernican revolutions. So after that, we have Kant, who has his own Copernican revolution in philosophy, where he puts into question reason and the faculties of understanding, and even it's like, you know the dogmatisms in philosophy, so far as, like, to question the phenomenon. It's like, it's not how things really are, but how they appear to me, which then puts into question my ability to grasp and comprehend the world. And that and in his own schematism, creates this idea of, like, you have the phenomenal world that I inquire and I can understand. All my concepts are rooted in intuitions and space and time. But then there's the noumenal world, which is outside my capacity. And people, like, in the mainstream, will interpret this as, like, and especially, like, in a sort of philosophy 101 class, or even like some, like, YouTube, like, 3-minute video on, like, philosophy 101 or the history of philosophy, as, like, the noumena as something, like, outside there, or like this is, like, this other world, this dualism. But actually the noumenal is, at least in the first critique, the noumenal is actually just the limit of reason itself, right? It's the product of reason as a limit, which puts a limit on what I can know. Um, but there is something outside of, uh, you know, my faculties of understanding that apprehend the world, that may exist, but that is sort of Kant's Copernican revolution. Freud's Copernican revolution is to deliver the final blow of making man not or the ego not the master of its own house, right? Um, with the discovery of the unconscious, and soon it'd be the discovery of the death drive. But the whole point, to go back to your speculation regarding these celestial body metaphors, it's like science is making these revolutions, but it's not like this sort of linear thing, because we do regress, right? But we always return back to our same place. So, and it's funny because Lacan will say in the later years that the real is always what returns to its place, right? It's making a sort of orbit, right? It's making its precession. Science is doing the same thing, right? Only to return back to its original starting point, right? And it's almost Hegelian in a sense, but you know, it's this fluctuation you could see from a heliocentric model and a Galilean science to a Ptolemaic model where the earth is the center, and a sort of deformed science which conforms to idealism and mystical thinking. And we could see this in a psychoanalytic perspective when uh you get Freud as making a Copernican shift, a Copernican revolution with the field of the unconscious. But then you have Jung, which regresses to a Ptolemaic world by um, making this sort of unconscious a collective thing, but then focusing on like individuation, like this sort of autonomy of the individual. But Freud's whole thing is that the unconscious is a discentrament of the subject and the subject of science. Whereas like for Jung, uh it's he switches the unconscious to a sort of Edward von Hartmann vitalistic will, and this is why he likes Kierkegaard, von Hartmann, Nietzsche, Schelling, this sort of unconscious of impulse and creativity, and spiritual vitalism. That's not Freud right there. Freud was aligned with science regardless of his limits to science. Like he was focused on a sort of scientism. That's why he couldn't look beyond the limits of science and see what psychoanalysis is offering. And that's why his question always remained, can psychoanalysis be a science? Freud or Lacan is like, what would a science look like that would include psychoanalysis? Because ultimately, psychoanalysis and its discourse and practice, I'll just end right here, is an extension of that Copernican revolution, or the extension of a Galilean science. Galilean science is modern science, but not only does it sort of focus on the Copernican revolution, it decenters man, but then also knowledge and discovery are in this sort of infinite universe versus the closed cosmos. This is why we get someone like Gödel that will say, a theory of incompleteness, right? Or why Lacan in his later years will say, when it comes to the science, like linguistics, there is no meta language, right? That's not a bad thing. It's the fact that we're operating in a discovery of knowledge and truth that's around a Galilean base, pretty much.
Yes. And I think we could say that Lacan's act is a kind of retrograde motion in relation to Freud, right? There's this retracing, this return to Freud, but it is simultaneously a revolutionary act, right? And I think he's staging that for us actually very explicitly with these cryptic epigraphs and the newborn's cry and these stammerings of speech. It's like this is almost like the first utterance of something absolutely psychoanalytic. This is the birth of its field in a way that has never been seen before. And maybe it was that Lacan felt that being in Rome, he could seize this opportunity, to kind of make an act out of his own discourse, right? And there is a tension also with science, because throughout this essay, there are various places where he formulates something like a critique of Freud's biological determinism and theory of instincts. And on the one hand, he says, okay, you guys have misunderstood like what Freud was actually getting at with that. Like he didn't elevate it to the level you're saying that he did, all of you who like use Freud's name to say that he was, it's all about instincts and so forth. He kind of debunks that, but at the same time, he's like, and yeah, I'm not saying that I'm bringing something a little more than that, like I'm going a step further in my notion of what is scientific. And so the fact that there is a thread of scientific inquiry in this essay is interesting to me because it otherwise strikes me as a very literary piece, a piece that tries to situate psychoanalysis in relation to language, in relation to linguistics, and something that is like a kind of textual experience and so forth, and that plays on all the possibilities inherent in that. And yet, again, for Lacan, the scientific inquiry is also still there. He's just enlarging that and saying, like, what would a psychoanalysis be? What is my own like revolution here with psychoanalysis, such that I can articulate it and let speech be the center pole that it's revolving around, like the sun, of our inquiry is speech itself. It's not the ego of the analyst, the ego of the analysand kind of like butting up against each other for countertransference as something that's supposed to be analyzed to be productive and meaningful. He's saying, forget all of that. We're both submitting ourselves at this sacrificial altar to have like communion with speech, like speech is the Eucharist here, I think, and even though he doesn't say that outright, I think this implication is here, and that's why the epigraph, another epigraph. I don't know why I dug into these epigraphs, but something struck me about him. But in section 1, he has this epigraph: "Put true and stable speech into my mouth, and make of me a cautious tongue." This is attributed to the internal consolation. This is from the Imitation of Christ, this reference. And this is not the first time he's going to mention the Imitation of Christ. And so what is Lacan telling us? Why is he bringing up the Imitation of Christ in relation to language, empty speech and full speech, and later on, he's going to elaborate this theme of the gift of speech even more, and he's going to bring in, Indian thinking on this. But I feel like there is this thread here from that Lacan is starting out with the West, and he's going to end up at the end of this essay in the East. And there's something of this like West to East tracing that he's doing as well. But he's starting out pretty strong, like Vatican, this Roman grammarian, the Imitation of Christ, in relation to empty speech, full speech. So it's like, what is being offered by the analysand? Is it nothing? Right? Because empty speech is nothing. Like there's nothing there. That's why it's empty, right? It has no substance. There's nothing substantial. There's nothing sacramental. There's nothing offered. There's nothing that could be given from it or derived from it. There's nothing to analyze either, for that matter, right? Analysis now could be seen as something kind of sacramental, but it needs a substance, And it's like, again, this in my own mind takes me back to like Vedic rituals of like offering something into the fire, like the soma is in the fire, like you offer something substantial into the fire, not just nothing. You can't make the connection if you put nothing in the fire. Like you have to put something nourishing, Why is there all this chanting and incantation, associated with that ritual? It's like, well, speech is already understood as being constitutive of the world, right? And constitutive of something offerable. So what is empty speech? What is full speech? Like full speech has something, it's the discourse of the unconscious. It's something significant has been said when that speech is full.
Just to the comparison of the Vedic rituals of sacrificing into the fire, it makes me think of this line right here. Because he puts into question what is the ego. It's not something that should be strengthened. This ego whose strength our theorists now define by its capacity to bear frustration is frustration in its very essence. Not frustration of one of the subject's desires, but frustration of an object in which his desire is alienated. And the more developed this object becomes, the more profound the subject becomes alienated from his jouissance. Now, this is like a jouissance that is alienated in an imaginary way, but I think when it comes like, so to go back to kind of elaborate on that point you made about like comparing it to like this point of sacrifice, it goes back to the importance of symbolic transference. And that has nothing to do with like just this sort of emotional pouring out onto the analyst where you feel safe and you could talk about them, or like the analyst trying to create a container or mirror. Rather, the symbolic transference operates from the field of language and speech, but then also something that allows the analytic work to continue to persist, and that's the payment, the method of payment, right? Because you're alienated in your jouissance. Now you get to sacrifice it into something that maybe was nothing, but it's now something in the form of currency, right? Now, this is different from like a capitalist transaction or exchange, because this payment is not meeting the demands of the market, right? Psychoanalysis does not have anything to offer to the demands of the market, like CBT and modern psychology does, right? Capitalists are creating a lot of private institutions for psychologists to operate, insurance, etc. The payment, of course, the analyst needs to live, so as far as like, we're in this economy, but the analyst practice itself and the transference don't give in to the MCM formula that Marx discovered. So this is also an interesting thing too. Like, you're sacrificing something and it has to hurt a bit, but at the same time, there's work that is going to be the outcome, the analytic work, um, the fruits of your labor that come out from the labor of speaking and speaking freely. And this goes back to, again, the distinction between empty speech and full speech, because even to talk about your mom and dad and the stereotypical Oedipalization of like wanting to kill your father and love your mother, that could very much be empty speech itself. Like, oh, if I talk about my mother enough and like my father, maybe like, I'm doing a good job in my session, like this is what the analyst wants to hear. But actually, no, that is nothing but idle chatter that keeps you from encountering the silence that you already have, because you don't want to say the thing that is actually on your mind, right? And so silence itself is constructed around the operation of speech, right? The silence doesn't even have to be a literal silence of not speaking at all, but the fact that you're making the unconscious silent itself, because it's trying to speak, but you're creating these detours uh, and contours by idle chatter, right? By even thinking that what you're saying is going to benefit you, because this is what I'm trying to get a reaction out of the analyst, because I'm talking about like, my frustrating childhood. And so you're alienating yourself already, right? But that fails, right? That's going to fail because eventually you stumble upon your own words. Uh, the analyst interrupts because something that was said was heard by the analyst, but you didn't hear it, right? And then it's relayed back to you. This message is relayed back to you to where there is an effect, an oracular truth, right? This is where the unconscious formation starts to occur, right? And even that interpretation can end in what's called the cut, and where we stop the session right there. Pay me, come back, right? There is a form of sacrifice, not only in like the method of payment, but it's like you get to sacrifice the thing that you're holding on to that's making you suffer to begin with, right? I think it's like what Zizek says about psychoanalysis. It's like it's the one place where you're allowed not to enjoy for the first time. And by enjoying, it's like enjoying your own suffering or enjoying your own symptom. And when you're when you're put in an analytic frame where the analyst is only focused on countertransference, or reintegrating the defenses into your ego, you're sort of like coddled, right? The unconscious itself is becoming foreclosed. In a
And
sense, like it's almost dangerous, because you end up kind of frustrating your patients so much that they become dependent on you. And when that fails, and when they see the inconsistency in the gap of you, then you may, in a sense, end up psychoticizing your patients. You may make your patients go mad, right?
Right. And I think that this raises a lot of interesting intersections and explorations because, like Lacan will actually explore in this essay, the nature of this symbolic pact, the symbolic exchange that is happening in analysis. And, in the essay that I wrote, that is like my response to this, A Hamlet on the Ganges, I explored this symbolic exchange in relation to the Indian concept of dakshina, right? Dakshina is a symbolic offering of money, but it also could be like fruit or flowers to a priest who conducts the ritual on your behalf, right? You pay the priest to make these offerings for you because they're seen as like being this intermediary between you and the divine, right? Now, we can also reject that and say, like, yeah, we don't need that intermediary. But the fact is, it's a symbolic intermediary. And the fact is that there is an intermediary. That is exactly what the symbolic is. It is the intermediary between the imaginary and the real, right? That's why we need to engage it with speech and with analysis. And so if we do, and we actually end up not in a realm of more imagination, we find ourselves actually in the realm of a symbolically enacted ritual. And this is where I see the analyst more in the function of priest, right? In the esoteric sense, in that, yes, you pay your analyst, but not for professional services rendered for an exact amount of time. You pay your analyst for the sake of the exchange that they are enabling for you, because the fact is, without the presence of the analyst, and even more importantly, the desire of the analyst, the speech of the analysand cannot come forth. It is this ritual and the transference of this ritual that calls forth the speech of the analysand, the full speech of the analysand, and it allows the offering to be made. It's not that the analyst is just some narcissist who wants to sit here and make money doing apparently nothing. In fact, there's actually a lot of work happening on both sides, Um, and this is where the second epigraph is instructive as well. Cause toujours. I don't know how to speak French, so I can't pronounce that perfectly, but he attributes it to a motto of causalist thought. But that phrase actually means something like, tell me more, say more. The invitation to speak, in other words, and, I was recently reading Betty Milan's memoir of her analysis with Lacan. And that's a common phrase from Lacan that she quotes is that, she would sit down and he would say, tell me. Tell me. Like this phrase to invite the analysand and to invite them from your own desire, like your own real interest, your genuine interest to hear like what they have to say, what they have to tell you,
Yeah, I really like that because this is what I wanted to get into in terms of language. Um, and I think that it is a perfect transition. I mean, of course, we're only focusing it from what I think what we agreed on, like the first two sections, or first section, but the two sections are comprised of the intro and section one, which is speech, full speech and empty speech. But the performativity of tell me or say more is really crucial when it comes to what Lacan means about language and its function. I mean, of course, we're talking about language as a field and speech as a function and act, but language too has that insofar as that it's operating through the navigation of speech. And in seminar one, when he's breaking this down, he talks about this segment from an analytic philosopher of language named J.L. Austin. And it's the text is called How to Do Things with Words. And I could be wrong. I think it's either J.L. Austin or another philosopher of language, although it might be in the same chapter or section, where you kind of like breaks down like this like three aspects of language, in which you have the field of recognition, in which like in order to speak, I recognize that there's a recipient or an addressee to which I speak. It's like, yes, this is a systematized thing, but this is something we all do every day. We speak. And so like to speak is to evoke the other, right? We're speaking to acknowledge that there is somebody else that will speak back to us or who will listen. Then you have what he, I think, calls communiqué, which is quite different from communication, which would just be like to relay meaning or to communicate something, to relay a message back. Communique is more like a press release, a broadcasting statement, right? So there's something more of a performative element to that. And then there's like also, I think I'm saying this out of order, but then there's also the aspect of language in which like uh you're able to sort of just play with, like you're able to create things with the combination of language, right? To use them in a specific way. It's use. Um and so like the way that it performs is interesting because in this example that you gave, say more, or just when the patient sits down, tell me, right? The statement itself is simple as just tell me, but there is a lot being performed in that saying itself that begs a lot of responses. Another example would be like vows. When you say I do, right? That contains a lot of things that aren't present in the statement itself, but in the saying. Or when you're at a dinner table and you're looking for the salt and you say, oh, there's the salt. It's not a matter of just trying to make a commonsensical fact of like that salt's right there. You're performing that you want that salt passed to you, right? So in a sense, these sorts of things are tools and operations to provoke um, unconscious speech, right?
Yes, and this is Lacan's huge point, which is that language is something like speech. The function of speech is to convey something that may not be explicitly stated in language. Speech operates on language in this way, in the sense that we can say things that have these implications, and that can mean something to someone who hears it, even though we haven't explicitly stated the meaning that seems to have been heard. Right. And this he developed later in relation to Indian linguistics. But what you brought up is exactly that. Like full speech has this level of resonance, right? It's something that can create a resonance in its communication, that it's addressed to someone who hears it and not only hears exactly what is said, but also hears what is conveyed by what is said. So the fact that there is a conveyance is something Lacan is very interested in. Like it puts us back on the power, the nature, the function of the enunciation.
And I think that's like something that's like you could juxtapose with what you would hear in the court of law. Uh, I swear, state my name, to speak the truth and nothing but the truth. So help me God. When you are unable or it's hard for you to speak the truth, you need the help of God. But in analysis, who helps you speak the truth? But the unconscious, which is the discourse of the other, right?
Yes.
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 Yeah. And you realize how alienated you are in your own speech, where this is coming out of your mouth, but it's so foreign to you. And I think we also have to kind of bring up the fact that you said this in the beginning, unconscious is structured like a language. This is a very Lacanian aphorism, a Lacanian phrase, but the language is structured like a language, but it isn't language. But what this structure is a form of repression, right? And this is why I said earlier about like non-censored speech, because the part of repression is not only forgetting about one's history, about one's traumatic encounter and one's constitution, but also that it can be censored as well. Now, repression isn't censorship, but this operates on the plane of repression in forms of the superego, right? Um, but even in an unconscious structure like a language that is also constituted by repression, you also have its hallmark, which becomes a linguistic crisscrossing. I think when you look, we don't, one of the things about full speech and empty speech is like these aren't like sort of two separate poles, but rather two intermingling poles to to the point where they create what Lacan calls a linguistic crisscrossing. And this isn't his own invention. This is rather him elucidating through the realm of linguistics what Freud already discovered in his essay on negation, right? I had a dream about a woman, but before you say anything, I can assure you this was not my mother, right? And so, in the sense of language, what is happening at the level of conscious speech is not fully integrated. It's it interrupts the empty speech or the empty discourse with concrete analytic discourse in that statement of the not mother, right? Negation is a way in which the unconscious structure, like a language, which is a repressive unconscious or a repressed unconscious, tries to alleviate those structures that sustain repression. But the one thing that negation cannot do is get rid of repression itself, right? It's sort of in operation thanks to repression, right? And it happens in these sort of statements of denial that sort of persist or just come up uh unintentionally.
And I think this is why in analysis we need like the dialectical reversal, you know, and this is what Lacan's talking about when he starts talking about the mirages, and like for example, there's one statement which I read as like a critique of Jungian individuation. He says he's quoting, "I was this only in order to become what I can be," end quote. If this were not the constant culmination of the subject's assumption of his own mirages, where could we find progress here? And then he goes on and he says something really interesting about empty speech, which is, I'll just read it. The analyst's art must, on the contrary, involve suspending the subject's certainties until their final mirages have been consumed. And it is in the subject's discourse that their dissolution must be punctuated. Indeed, however empty his discourse may seem, it is so only if taken at face value. The value that justifies Mallarmé's remark, in which he compares the common use of language to the exchange of a coin, whose obverse and reverse no longer bear but eroded faces, and which people pass from hand to hand in silence. This metaphor suffices to remind us that speech, even when almost completely worn out, retains its value as a tessera.
That's such a good line right there. Yeah, but I mean, like, I really like what he says. Like, no matter how empty the discourse may seem, it is only if taken at face value, right? But if I understand the metaphor correctly, it's like the passing of the coin. Um, it no longer bears that like eroded face. It's like rather than like speech being worn out like a coin, it's only a matter until like its worn outness ends up revealing something about the stamping or the striking of the coin. Um, if I understand how he uses that, because like we could see how in an empty speech discourse, it's just I hate to use this because it's not like there's some like internal depth, but like it's so face value or it's a sort of superficial speech, but it's like if anything, what it really conceals is what's structuring that bond to begin with, right? Discourse is a bond and it's sustained by speech, right? And I think for him, it's the analytic discourse that really reveals um, why one chooses to speak or not, or why one enters into these repetitive bonds only to suffer, right? And then wonder why. And through the analytic discourse, it's the oracular truth, which is not know thyself, but rather he does not know, right? Because with the neurotic, they're always asking the question that they don't want the answer to, you know, uh, they don't want to know. He does not want to know, right? the unconscious, and going back to like, the sort of the Oedipus myth. It's like the dead father. He does not know that the father is dead, right? But he still persists, right? Or it's the father that does not know he is dead, and so he still persists in, the unconscious. It's like Hamlet's father as a ghost still persisting.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that there's something in this thing about the coins, right? Back to the symbolic exchange, like there's a money connotation on the one hand, right? There's also something divinatory here. Like you can cast the I Ching with coins, the coin method. But Mallarmé is a French poet. And I think that this is a reference to his poem, A Throw of the Dice. So there's that. But why is Lacan even referencing that? It's almost like saying, well, on the one hand, there is this exchange of coins, right? On the other hand, there's something about the face value, right? Again, face value has another resonance of meaning, which is the mirror stage, the mirages that are needing to be consumed, punctuated, etc., right? And then there's also something here in that even when the analysis appears to be saying nothing, the analyst is the one who can punctuate it and give this kind of freewheeling, apparently meaningless transcription a grammatical structure from which something meaningful can be derived, And this idea of punctuation, right? It's like the analyst prepares the transcription of the analysand's discourse. And so even when there's this emptiness, there is nonetheless, like in the emptiness, the surface of it, something is being obscured, something is being censored in this emptiness. And so I think he's kind of pointing to something on the side of the analyst a bit, and then there's this exchange of coins, and that there's this artifact, that speech nonetheless remains even when nothing seems to have been said. And so that's why he continues to say, even if it communicates nothing, discourse represents the existence of communication. Even if it denies the obvious, it affirms that speech constitutes truth. Even if it is destined to deceive, it relies on faith and testimony. Back to the vow, in a way.
Yeah, and it's like, the faith and testimony. It's like a vow of like returning, or it's just like when the analyst like ends the session, let's continue tomorrow. All right, or like, these sorts of gestures that are not really coercive. They're not coercive at all, and yet it puts into question the sort of autonomy of one's ego, right? Where Lacan will even make this like question regarding the relationship of the ego to the German term Aufklärung, which is really enlightenment, right? Like the sort of enlightenment of modernity in which like we're awakened from like, our own immaturity, to quote Kant, but rather the way that speech functions, it compels you, right? It's like you didn't make that individual choice necessarily in this sort of interested consciousness, or self-interested ego. No, nor were you really like in a bondage or coerced to come, but it's rather there's a yeah, it's transfer. It's being compelled to come back and pouring out the faith via the testimony. And it doesn't even have to be in the sense of like the analyst like using a phrase like let's continue tomorrow, or we shall see next time, right? Or like let's return to this same topic in our next encounter. um it could be the fact that what the analyst said in intervening on the analyst's speech had so much of an effect that they're like, what do they mean by this? Like, I have to know, right? Dare to know, pretty much.
I think that's interesting too, like just to free associate on that for a minute. Like some of my analyses use expressions like that to me. They're like, okay, let's just put a bookmark here and just a footnote on this. And I've never like told them that like, oh, Lacan's whole thing is that the unconscious is a text that, can be like discoursed in this way. And they are already relating to their own speech as something textual, which again points to the fact that for Lacan, it's not just that we have these theories and then we kind of like auto-suggest them to ourselves in the clinic. It's
Yeah.
that this is what's happening. This is what there is to observe, to
Yeah.
punctuate, to note, to see. And
Yeah.
and he's kind of saying like, in a way the analyst doesn't have to worry about is this an empty speech or a full speech. Their only prerogative is to speak.
Yeah. Yeah. Tell me. Say
Tell me.
more. And it's just listening on the surface. Like there's no like depth that we have to like unveil or dig through or uncover. It's not like the Jungian was it Nekia of like going to the underworld, right? Nor is it like, developing a third ear like Theodore Reich. It's just like, no, it's just like when you focus on the patient's speech, that requires you to just listen, and you will see that everything that seems to be hidden is actually on the surface. It's not that it's actually hidden at all. It's just sort of distorted, or it's obscure because of how the analysand's ego is trying to operate to misrecognize, because that's the whole point of the ego. It's not that it's already frustration in its essence, but its function is to misrecognize its own truth that it speaks, right? To not want to know.
It's why it's a riddle, especially, the hysterics riddle, or the for the obsessional also there are this ciphered speech that needs to be deciphered
Yeah.
or just punctuated, because in other places Lacan makes the point that like Chinese, like archaic Chinese did not have any grammar, like no, not grammar, but punctuation. And when there's no punctuation, like the sense of meaning is ambivalent. It's not clear what's being said, what is meant exactly. It's ambiguous. And so this idea that punctuation restores speech to something that is actually has use value, is interesting.
Did you mean to say ambivalent at first, or were you trying to say
I
ambiguous?
was trying to say ambiguous, so it was a
Yeah,
slip.
but I like that though, because in a sense there, I mean, it can be ambivalent to the analysan, right? To it's sort of, if there's this insistence on loving with their own constituted um language that helps them navigate, even if it's like, ultimately to make them suffer. Once the fallibility of their own logic, of their own, as he says, right? Part of the analyst's job is to suspend one's certainty. When the certainty given by one's sort of worldview, the way they map it out, their own logic, that can lead to that sense of ambivalence, that they're literally that classical saying, there's a thin line between love and hate, and that thin line is just one's own certainty that needs to be suspended, right? Because he does say when the signifier fails, right, love turns into hate. The three passions in psychoanalysis are love, hate, and ignorance, right?
Right, exactly. Which we've discussed on more than one occasion in relation to Buddhism, the three mental poisons.
Yeah. What is it?
Uh
It's a aversion, attachment, and ignorance, right?
Jealousy?
Or
Something
oh,
it
yeah,
gets
yeah.
confused in my mind sometimes. Ha- Aversion is
It's
hatred as well, right? And then
yeah,
there's ignorance, and then
ignorance,
there's jealousy or
jealousy.
attachment.
Yeah,
Sometimes it's
jealousy. Yeah,
attachment.
I've heard it translated as jealousy, or like, yeah, or attachment, but it's like what the dukkha's, right? That's what they are.
Right,
Yeah.
right,
Yeah.
exactly, exactly. So yeah, I'm also looking at this passage here where Lacan says, this is page 211. I have thus far approached the function of speech and analysis from its least rewarding angle, that of empty speech, in which the subject seems to speak in vain about someone who, even if he were such a dead ringer for him that you might confuse them, will never join him in the assumption of his desire. I like that about the fact is that empty speech is emptied of the subject's desire.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, because part of that is like, and again, in the early Lacan of like this in seminar one, part of the analytic work is to what does he say? What psychoanalysis does is to restore and reconstitute the subject's history, right? History that's not because it was in the past, but because it's how it's lived out now, right? You make the past present, you bring life to it in speaking about it, right? But if you're caught in the empty speech, what you're doing is emptying out your desire and alienating it further in this imaginarized image of how you conceive yourself, the other, and the world. And when you're able to make full speech present for Lacan, that also means to reintegrate the subject's desire, right? But it doesn't mean that we're fully going to realize our own desire, be who we are, you know, because this is not something that you pay the analyst for to uh, cope, to develop skills. You're not paying for a profession, but what you're doing in investing your life and working through, because that's the key point he makes in this essay, is like this concept of working through.
Right.
And part of working through for Freud is also remembering, right? Remembering your history. And that's constructed through what we've been harking on, speech and language. And so you're able to integrate your own alienated desire, because what is desire for Lacan? But it's man's desire is the other's desire. You alienate yourself in the other's desire as if it were your own jouissance. And it doesn't mean another person. It just means like an other, a field of knowledge which you beg a question, right? What does it mean to be truly alive? I feel like I'm dead. I'm so unhappy in all my relationships, like, all my ex-boyfriends and like even the marriages I've been in. I try to do all the right things and it seems like, they're assholes and, I feel dissatisfied. Am I even a woman? What does it mean to be a woman? Or the biggest question for the obsessional neurotic, which is, not am I alive? What does it mean to live? Because I feel like I'm dead, but rather, what is a father? Right? What does it mean to be the father of the primal horde that bears the phallus and enjoys all X, Y, and Z, right? The one who is enjoying and is not alienated or castrated.
And this is the essay where Lacan first uses the phrase "the name of the Father." You
Yeah,
know? And
yeah.
so again, it's like this is tied into language, it's tied into speech, it's tied into analysis, it's tied into the symbolic, you know? It's tied into all of these things. And this whole thing about history, I think, is important because he does start seminar one this way, like getting into history, his point being that history is not the past, it's the way that the subject historicizes themselves in the present.
Mhm,
And again, this is back to the mirror stage because he's already made the point, that it's in the mirror stage that the subject creates this temporal dialectic through which the I function, is constitutive of a historical self, basically. It projects itself into history, right? And so I think there is something about psychoanalysis that in the present moment that is kind of trying to allow the subject to rewrite their own history, like
mhm.
rewrite their own epic. And he actually uses that word on the next page. He uses the word epos, 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 which is, the etymology of the word epic. Um, so he's trying
He's
to
trying
say
to.
that there's something about psychoanalysis that's like the writing of an epic,
Mhm.
and earlier he also uses this funny Latin phrase, the hic et nunc,
Yeah.
which means the here and the now. And I think he's referencing Bion, who had an emphasis on this idea of like analysis as a present time encounter.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, and also, like, it goes back to the, like, the here and now of interpretation as if, like, it only has to do between it, like whatever's happening in the session is only between, you and I, the way that you relate to me, and that couldn't be that could be further from the truth. Like that's um not what analysis is supposed to be, because with that third body of language also has not only the synchronic aspect of how meaning is generated through metaphor and the way that all these different words can map out into slips of the tongue, forgetting of names, but the diachrony aspect, the time factor, the way that discourse is sustained, and he'll even attribute the diachronic element of time as like what really constitutes discourse, like its real component. But what's interesting about like this history part, and I also want to read this quote out because I've been thinking about it a lot. It's a very interesting way. I love when like Lacan, because you mentioned like these like quotes from poets and different saints and mystics, but right here like he contrasts like psychoanalysis in terms of like Freud's discovery of like the subject's history from the science of history itself, right? Um, and he says that you know uh, there's a brute aspect of trauma when it comes to history that Freud's able to discover, but the science of history does not really want to acknowledge. He says events are engendered in a primal historicization. In other words, they're being made on the stage and played out in the hearts of men and outside. And he gives examples like Saint Antoine and the actors of the victory of and the defeat of the Parliament. He's talking about the French Revolution, and also at one time there's this another aspect of it where it's the proletariat or the bourgeoisie, the common people, uh, uh, and he's really just trying to elaborate like in these different moments of history, someone always pays the price. And to end this sort of passage of this quote, I mean that they do not leave behind the same sort of memory in men's minds. So to conclude it, what's really interesting about this quote is then he goes on to say, this is because with the disappearance of the reality of the parliament and the court, the first event will always return to its traumatic value, allowing for a progressive and authentic effacement, unless its meaning is expressly revived. Whereas the memory of the second event, so the first event has to do with, the defeat of Parliament and of the court by Faubourg Saint Antoine, and the second one is another element of French revolutionary history where we're facing a class struggle in the Marxist sense of proletariat versus the bourgeoisie, the exploiters and the exploited class. So he says right here, and the second event will remain very much alive even under censorship, just as the amnesia brought on by repression is one of the liveliest forms of memory. As long as there are men who enlist their revolt in the struggle for the proletariat's political ascension, that is, men for whom the key words of dialectical materialism have meaning. Now, this is a very interesting stab at Marxism, but to not get lost in that parenthetical of like thinking like Lacan is interested, he is, but his whole analogy of like these two different types of memory in history. On the one hand, there is a traumatic value of the parliament and the court, because what are the parliament and the court? They're representatives, right? Now, to kind of free associate off of this, one of Freud's fundamental concepts and description of the unconscious is this German term Vorstellung Repräsentanz, which is translated into English as like the ideation and ideational representation, right? Which just means that like there is a dislocation between an idea and its affective dimension. And so this is how, for Freud, the unconscious repression operates, that you have a series of affects that, transform, but the affect of anxiety and what points to a traumatic value or a traumatic historical memory is thus effaced um, from its idea, right? The image of it, the unconscious thought. So unconscious thinking that persists to repress the traumatic event is dislocated from the affective element of it. I think this is like ultimately like Lacan also likes this part of Freud because this deals with this idea of memory traces, but that how memory traces and even the effacement of it are built in with a uh linguistic factor, right? And the second part of censorship is that like in this bourgeoisie, this class struggle, there is a contradiction. There is a real antagonism, right, going on in historically, and it could still persist consciously, but it's censored. So we never really get to speak the actual traumatic or historical origins of it because we live under censored speech. The truth is always censored, right? And so you could continue talking about uh, uh, the knowledge of history without understanding, the origins of it because of censorship, right? Versus on the one hand, you have a representative symptom to be able to handle that traumatic encounter. I don't know if that makes any sense or not, but I'm trying to just like kind of riff because I think that's like that weird analogy of like, um, on the one hand, the defeat of Parliament and what Parliament is supposed to do represent, and on the other hand, the regression of Marxism into Stalinist or Marxist revolution into Stalinist censorship and bureaucracy seem to be two aspects of how history can function for the subject. For Freud's discovery of history in the subject, the need for representation to handle a traumatic value, even if that representation is obscure, and then also uh, the meaning of censorship to avoid the truth.
Yeah, I wondered the same thing. Was like, how did we get to Marx, dialectical materialism, the proletariat, and the bourgeois? All of this suddenly, he went into it, and I was hoping that you would comment on it, which you did. So I think that you're right in picking up that the thread here is in relation to censorship. You know, and to bring back an old thread, which was Galileo, you know, on the previous page, um, he prefaces what he's about to say about censorship by saying, and the psychoanalysts pour si mauvais has the same impact as Galileo's, which is not that of a fact-based experiment, but of an experimentum mentis. So that phrase, I don't even know if I pronounced it correctly, but it means, and yet it still moves. And which is what Galileo said in response to everyone decrying his observation as being untrue or heretical, right? And so that there's a motive there to censor the truth, right? Galileo already has revealed the truth, but then it's being censored, and yet it still moves. And then Lacan saying, yeah, the science of psychoanalysis is not necessarily a fact-based experiment, but it's a mental experiment, you know? And then he says this interesting remark: the unconscious is the chapter of my history that is marked by a blank or occupied by a lie. It is the censored chapter, but the truth can be refound. Most often, it has already been written elsewhere.
Yeah. No, yeah, that's so good. And I also wanted to bring up the fact that like for Freud, history is not chronology. Like the memory disturbances and psychical trauma for early Freud of like case studies on hysteria and even like when he's working on the theory of seduction and he abandons it like in like 18 like 95 I think or 96. um it's always related to an actual chronological point in a patient's life that they could situate, right? So there is both a sort of genetic regression that could occur, or something that's disturbing the analysan that points to an actual concrete moment in their development. But it's from the case study of the Wolfman where we don't see any of that occur. This is where he again, and I will finally come into this German term Nachtraglichkeit, right?
Mm.
This after the fact, this retroactive cause that the trauma is actually structured of the subject insofar as it's reconstituting its history. It's not that like history is the past, rather the history is lived and it's reconstituting that trauma is already structured. And what we have is a retroactive cause, that the cause of uh the way that the signifier affects the patient, or the way that the truth that is heard in the session affects the patient, is constituting the formation of the subject's history, right? Which is not chronological, but logical. It is what Lacan will call logical time, which goes back to this point of suspending of certainty. I really think we should like definitely dedicate a solo episode to this logical time essay. But just to give a brief, like, rundown, the logical time has to do with this game of the prisoner's dilemma, in which the warden says, due to unforeseeable circumstances, I have to let one of you free, right? But in order to do that, you will do this game in which you will guess by logical deduction which one of you is the free subject. I have here 3 white discs and 2 black discs, and it's like, I think it's like the one who is, I think, all white is the free one, and you have to decipher that, and you can only do that by using logical deduction. You can't speak to one another, right? But you can look at them. Um, and so, like, the caveat is that those 2 black discs aren't used. And so when the game starts, there's this hesitation, and the one prisoner thinks, well, they're looking at me, and I must not be the subject. I must have like the black and white, or maybe I'm all black. But if that were the case, they would have moved right away. So I am the free subject. I have all white disc, and here's how I know. And he develops the scheme. And so, right as he's done formulating his reasoning and deduction, they all stand up at once and leave the room to tell the warden, right? And so he calls this perfect sophism, because you could have this elaborate reason and logical conclusion, but he says, if this assertion is false, the conclusion is necessarily also fallacious, and you could still make a logical certainty of that, right? So like, he's arguing off of bad faith, but then also like, because the conditions only seem so to be the case. So it's like this distinction between like what in legal terms we call the protasis and apodosis. You have a clause and you have its condition. And so like, to dumb it down, it's like, well, if you're hungry, go make a sandwich, right? The clause is you're hungry. So if you're hungry, by condition, go make a sandwich. If you love her, then marry her, right? So this is the way that like protasis and apodosis, or to be more prevalent to psychoanalytic theory and philosophy, I think, therefore I am, right? So this is how that game operates. I am the free subject, and here is how I know. And then I conclude right there. But the problem is that this certainty is flawed, so it causes one to retroactively go back. How does that relate to psychoanalysis right here? Is because the logical time creates a anticipatory element, and an anxious moment to conclude, but then you never fully conclude. You always go back. And so this is how history and time operate for the subject in this logical way. Every time that they try to conclude or be certain about something about themselves, they have to second guess that knowledge and their judgment and go back to rethink. The analyst's point is to suspend the certainty and to keep them in what Lacan will call the moment of understanding, to constantly go back and think before you go to this moment of conclusion, right?
Yeah, I think
Because
yeah, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, because the neurotic is always falling into these protasis and apodosis. I'm a failure, or no, I didn't go to law school just like my father and his grandfather, therefore I am a failure, right? or like I didn't get a white house and picket fence, or like well, no, a house with a white picket fence and a family. Therefore, I'm not a man, right? Um, all these sorts of sophistic and fallacious conclusions, but for some reason they have a pathological effect on the subject's existence, right? How the signifier and language operate in a way that makes them constantly go back to this like sort of reasoning where uh I am this only if I have that. I don't have that, therefore I'm not this, right?
Right, right, exactly. And these are the mirages, right? And I think that you tied it very nicely back to the mirror stage. The functional anticipation of the subject in the mirror stage, having encountered his own image, as himself, um, and thus projected himself into a spatial lure of identification and a temporal, projection into history, right? This is the spatiotemporal complex that we call, you know, I myself, and Lacan is saying this is an imaginary construct, which means that you can never catch up with that which you anticipate. The subject remains like in anticipation of the very thing that it never arrives at. And in the mirror stage essay, he uses this word asymptotically to make the point that it's like this is a straight line that never meets the thing that it thinks it's going to meet. Like you are forever distant. You are alienated, you know, from the thing that you are anticipating. And so it's like this motor delay of the mirror stage, yet this assumption of control of the specular image, and yet this apparent orthopedic totality is premature. It's not complete. It's a fragmented body. And so I think it's notable that we've brought up logical time in relation to this because that is in fact the first footnote that Lacan makes in this essay is to point the reader to logical time, the essay logical time. And so I do think we should do a solo episode on that since there's a nexus here. Um, but
I
yeah,
should
I think
also, yeah, I
Mhm.
was gonna say
Go
I
ahead.
should also add, like in my long-winded tangent to get to logical time, that
Mhm.
it's not just Wolfman that makes Freud develop a theory of the traumatic that isn't predicated on a chronological event in in the subject's like development or childhood, but what Lacan always goes back to it that like most students of Freud and even psychoanalysts after Freud have not encountered is his letter 52 to Fleece, where he develops sort of topography of memory traces that, when combined a certain way, create an effect, a residue that doesn't really indicate anything that happens in one's childhood development, but it's rather something, I guess, to use the term that you use, temporal, something that activates a sort of temporal dimension of the subject. It could be a question of a fantasy, right? Or of a symptom that has that historicization dimension, but it's not located in the past, right? It's being acted out now, right? And that could not like it can manifest not only in the patient's speech recounting their history in the past, but it could also manifest in dreams as well, right? Um, and again, going back to the dream like a rebus, when you have it in a rebus, you have this sort of uh combinatory factor. And I think that's a key word because Lacan will take that up and talk about language and the symbolic having this sort of combinatory effect. And you brought up grammar, and it's no reason why this combinatory mathematics for Lacan is synonymous to the combinatory factor in language because you don't get a truth value or an effect until things are combined together. So, like, Bruce Fink has this one thing, and I think it's his commentary on a Purloined Letter, that in rules in grammar only exist not as like presuppositions but only because you have the combination first. For example, I before E except after C didn't exist before the English language. The English language is instantiated in writing and speaking, and there you have grammatic rules that take place, right?
And this reminds me somewhere in here, he criticizes Bergson's concept of duration, right, as something continuous. And again, like here we have the fact that history is not continuous, you know?
Exactly,
It's in a
exactly, exactly.
strange, it's in a division, which is the divided subject itself. In fact, it may be the very thing that is dividing the subject against itself, you know, in which it's not able to stand.
Hmm.
And so I think that's interesting too, that it's like it's not this Bergsonian duration, this continuity of time. It's the fact that there is a split in the subject in relation to time, you know?
Hmm.
And this is where uncertainties arise. This is where anticipations arise. This is where assumptions of mirages arise. And this is what psychoanalysis is here to really undo, you could say.
Well, yeah, and there's not only an inconsistency or a cut in history that makes it not continuous, but I think that also, begs the question of repetition. You know,
Mm,
I think like with that, we have to take into account with history, there's repetition, the repetition of the subject, right? And he does mention that I think the death drive briefly in this essay,
right.
but like, that there is this repetition in the way that the patient in the analytic session is going back to these motifs in their life and they're so fixated on it, and they don't want to repeat them, but then they ironically end up doing that just to come back to analysis. Said I did the thing that I promised I swore I wouldn't do. And then you also have Freud's discovery of repetition in the death drive when when he gives the example of his grandson playing the Fort Da game to master, the separation scene of his mother leaving by tossing the toy and then trying to rediscover it only to toss it again. Really, what this is an anecdote for is, the repetition of history, not of the past, but the way that speech symbolizes it, the way that language symbolizes it and gives it a sort of logic in a game, but speech tries to articulate about it in some way or another, but it's never fully uh, consistent. That's why we always have to come back to analysis more to again remember, repeat, and work through.
Yeah, and I think this leads into like what I wanted to I mean, this is how Lacan concludes section 1, and and it struck me. He mentions the ancient quarrels over nature and grace. This is another reference to the imitation of Christ, and nature here represents like original sin, the fall of man. You know, grace is redemption, right? And he says, um, it is to be hoped that a better appreciation of the functions of the logos will dissipate the mysteries of our fantastic charismata. But then he quotes um, La Rochefoucauld, something like that. He's saying there are,
La Rochefoucauld, yeah, who's
yeah,
a
that's
famous
it.
actress, yeah.
Yeah, he says there are people who would never have fallen in love but for hearing love discussed. And then Lacan comments on that to say, not in the romantic sense of a thoroughly imaginary realization of love that would make this remark into a bitter objection, but as an authentic recognition of what love owes to the symbol and of what speech brings with it by way of love. I thought this was a rather mystical statement from Lacan about love, um, where he's saying that it's not that because they heard love being discussed that now there's love, you know, like as if it's just an imaginary thing, like co-opted, you know, in the hearing of it. He's saying, no, it's the fact of speech, it's the function of speech that gives love, you know, its graceful function, basically. And here I think he's speaking of love in a redemptive sense as the function of grace. Speech is grace, you know, logos being like the incarnation of the word, you know. In the beginning was the word. You know, again, I think this is getting into a realm of Lacan that I really love, which is quite mystical.
Yeah, and I'm thinking because I haven't read a lot of La Rochefoucauld, but he's very much influential on Nietzsche's writing style because of how
Mm.
aphoristic he was, and he lived in like a in like a sort of bourgeois Parisian lifestyle, in like the I think 1700s. But like he just writes about like the pettiness of man, the trials and tragedies that men fall into and also subject one another to, their dissatisfaction for life and like their like taste for luxury and dissatisfaction. He says like love is self-love, but it's not like in the sense of like learning to love yourself. It's rather this sort of disinterested or indifference to one another, and it's really this sort of passion for uh a narcissistic love, but that you like project onto others. Like I think that's like how I think Lacan even references La Rochefoucauld in Seminar too. But all that to say, like it's like in that sense, like there is this sort of narcissistic, mundane, and pettiness to this form of love. And it's like when you give it grace by speaking about it, I think you also reveal the sort of idiotic and even petty nature of one's own alienation, right? And one's own suffering, where it's like it's no longer a tragedy anymore. It's rather, as Lacan says, what makes psychoanalysis what it is. It starts to become funny. You're able to be like, it's not like this, like, here's the answer to your symptom. You're like, oh my God, like, I am so, like, liberated of my desire, yada, yada, yada. I could go on. And it's like, oh my fucking God, is that really it? And you're
Mm.
just like, I'm an idiot. Or like I've heard like someone like Bruce Fink say like the end of analysis could be that somebody's just like mad at the analyst, like, are you fucking kidding me? And just fucking leaves and that's it.
Mm.
Like it's
Mhm.
so like um I guess the word is like banal, but also just like it is liberating in the sense like when you're able to give love itself grace by speaking, but then also in the La Rochefoucauld sense, you're able to speak about that aspect too, because then you realize like how you were and are as a person and why you still suffer, and you can love differently. Love that isn't a bondage, but love as a sort of analytic extension now, right?
Right, which is transference, right?
Yes, yes.
And that's why he's making the distinction between imaginary love, the symbolic. Then he says later, the realization of perfect love is the fruit not of nature, but of grace, right? So the imaginary love is already coming from the divided subject.
Yeah, yeah,
And the redemption, we can only have redemption in speech.
yeah, yeah. I mean, and like this is why he likes this notion of the saint or like sainthood, right? Not that like the analysan that goes through analysis and that the analytic frame is terminated and they become like saints that you see like in medieval art with the little like yellow orb over their head. But like there's something about them when they transmit their like own testimony, their own knowledge, they do the past, that it has an effect on you, where it's like, how you mentioned the Betty Milan thing, and Lacan just says, tell me, um where there's that effect when one conducts a sort of testimony about their experience and analysis, or just one just talks and can't help but transmit knowledge in a certain way. Maybe it's not tell me, but the person that is receiving that message in the analytic forms is compelled to ask more, right? In a sense, I can't help but think of, and you might like this, like the way that the koan functions to make the student of the Roshi ask more questions, dare to know, right? The analyst tells their patient, tell me, or say more. The patient who is now ended their analysis and walks into the world goes up to people and says, dare to know, right? That's how I see it, at least.
Right, and there's a suspension of certainty.
Yeah.
It's like the
Yeah.
koan is delivered. You don't really know what it means, but then the afterwardness, right? The
Yeah.
apreku, you
Yeah.
contemplate it, you come to know something
Yeah.
about it. and not necessarily in the form of knowledge, but in the form of epiphany, in the form of understanding, a sudden knowing, even a gnosis, we could say.
Yeah.
And so I think all of that can only happen in the transference, and this takes us into transference as transmission,
Mhm.
as love, as something constitutive of love in the real sense,
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah.
And yeah, maybe that's a good place to conclude our
Yeah.
exploration.
Yeah, for the first section.
For the first section, there's still
Yeah.
much more to come.
Yeah, yeah. We didn't even get to talking to, like, the nitty-gritty stuff of, like, this is just the surface.
This is just the surface. It's true. This is a massive, massive
Yeah.
piece.
Yeah.
So stay tuned.
Yeah. Stay tuned, y'all.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Parletra. If you enjoyed this conversation, consider subscribing to our Patreon at patreon.com/parletrapodcast, or follow us on YouTube and Instagram at Parletra Podcast to stay tuned for our next episode.